Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me. I guess it's nice to have a small intimate group to get to just, sit down and share my research and think with you all. I've had the opportunity to share some of this work in bigger conferences, but the problem with these bigger conferences is it's always, harder to get like some, I don't know, just more intimate time and sit down and really think with people about what came up. So thank you for the opportunity to share this work with you. Let me start my stopwatch. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about Nishida's philosophy of education, a pragmatist reading. I maybe I should. Well, I've already been introduced, but yeah, I'm actually on sabbatical right now, and as you were mentioning, I've been bouncing about, so I'm in Germany right now, but I'm technically still affiliated with the INALCO in Paris, in Paris, and I was there for I think 10 months, and been bouncing around since then. And a lot of this is sharing a new direction in which my work is turning. Most people know me as Watsuji Tetsuro scholar. He's an ethicist, yeah, and actually very heavily influenced by Confucianism. But slowly after that, I moved to work on Mori Akira, who is a younger member of the Kyoto School, second generation. But these days, I've been realizing that to really deepen his core insights, I had to go back to the first generation to where it all started. So this is sharing that new direction in the work. Um, yeah, so basically the core question that I want to start with that I personally is something that means a lot to me is the question of how do we see the student? What does it mean to see the student, to really see them? And I guess there are a lot of different tendencies, like to see the student just as a human resource or just as a point on the league table, or as an individual with unique desires, which seems like a positive thing, but I have questions about later. To see the student as a moral agent, which is also a positive thing. But again, is that all they are? And so, really centering on this idea of Nishida Kitaro of educating the student as a concrete historical person. So I'm going to get to that later. So this is going to be the flow of the talk. Again, one of the things I'm going to try to do is try to make it accessible. Like Paul said, also for me, it's very important to make it real. Not to just float off into abstraction. Nishida is notoriously abstract. But yeah. So I'll try to keep it there on the ground. Okay, so this is Nishida Kitaro. Does anyone do Japanese philosophy? Paul wrote a book on this stuff, so I guess Paul is aware of these figures. Catherine was in my class, so but Roe and Kasser, I'm not sure. Have you ever worked on Japanese? No, but anyway, so Nishida is part of the founder of the Kyoto School of Philosophy, and then right now when it comes to Japanese philosophy, pretty much the Kyoto School of Philosophy is the biggest name, for better or for worse. They're very well known for the philosophy of nothingness, in contradistinction to the philosophy of being. They're very well known for this Buddhist influence. So they were the school of philosophy that resisted just importing Western ideas during the Meiji period, but to actually use Japan's cultural resources to respond critically to different influences, especially from Germany. And so right now, it's research has really spread beyond Japan, and I just came from the European Network of Japanese Philosophy, and most of it was about the Kyoto School. So he was the founder of the Kyoto School, very, very abstract writing style, writes about ideas like pure experience, self-awareness, logic of place, Buddhism, religiosity, and so on. But what people don't realize is actually he was deeply involved in the field of education and what they call the Kyoto School of Education. And I really want to stress this. It's not just a theoretical influence. So everybody in Japan knows Nishida Kitaro. I mean, there's basically a philosopher's walk that's named after him. the center exam for high school students. His name is on it. I mean, everyone knows Nishida. But the influence isn't just because people know about him, but he actually was there on the ground. Jacinto Zavala mentions, his philosophy of cultivation and education. He had experiences as a teacher in middle school, higher school, juku. He advised the Ministry of Education during the wartime period. Very, very messy involvement. Got into a huge fight with him. Michiko Yusa, who does a lot of autobiographical work on Nishida, shows if you look at his Nishida's letters, you see that he was regularly talking to the Minister of Education, to the Prime Minister. They visit him at home. He was remarkably involved politically, and he even got into a spat with the Ministry of Education over their attempts at thought control. He quit his advisory role, so he was quite in my opinion, a very what do you call this important resistance also to certain attempts of nationalism and imperialism, although some people might paint him in a different light. And Yano Satoji Sensei at Kyoto University came up with this book on the bottom right. I think it's there. But very, very important work pointing out basically just mapping everyone who was influenced by him. So from ideals to policy to pedagogy to moral education, civics education, classroom management even. And the thing is, because the the younger members of the Kyoto School got heavily implicated with supporting the wartime regime. And there was a bit of an allergy, anything that smelled remotely traditionally Japanese, they kind of freaked out about because of the horrors of what they did during the war. And so people just didn't want to talk about the Kyoto School anymore. But what Yano Sensei did was he basically found all of these hidden influences. And it's a huge, I think, 800-page book, a wonderful book. And this is not just in Japanese now, there's growing research in English. So Paul Standish is right here. But his book with Saito Naoko basically introduces this whole thing, how you have the move from the Kyoto School of Philosophy to the Kyoto School of Education. And then recently, Catherine's very modest in her self-introductions, but she was actually the main translator for Nishida Tadashi's Philosophy of No Mind. So, looking at this whole philosophy of education and how it's grounded in the idea of no mind, which connects to Zen, to the theory of aesthetic cultivation, Zeami, no theater, martial arts. And so that's available in English too as a one whole volume. And then I have a book that is actually already done. That was the main thing I did here during my sabbatical. And yeah, it even has a cover. And it should be out by Feb 2026. It's already in the press. I mean, with the printing press, it's already been laid out and everything. But anyway, and the main idea that I raise in this book is this whole idea of education for emptiness. So on one hand, the very Watsujian element of on one hand having this sense of individuality and this sense of communality and having both sides, but maintaining the tension between them. How when we try to emphasize one, we tend to lose touch with the other pole. Just like with certain Confucian tendencies, if you're not careful, really lose the sense of creative individuality. But then, in the same way, if we overstress the existential individuality, sometimes you lose touch with the whole. And then to that, I add the Mori Akira and this idea of this tensional relationship between the subjective and objective. How, on one hand, when we learn, we're negating the brute facticity of things in order to create meaning. But at the same time, if we get stuck with meaning and we lose their grounding in the facts, then we have the opposite problem. So also negating this subjectivity to flexibly return to how we actually experience things. And so see these tensions and this flexible movement between contradictions of the human being as the heart of education. So not a single principle education, but an education that embraces this ambiguity that lies in the heart of our human experience. So that's my book. And while I was writing my book, since it's just us, maybe I can be very frank. Actually, I never mentioned Nishida at first. I was halfway through writing my book. And then my student Takaya, I think Paul knows Takaya, yeah? But anyway, Takaya Shoko, she was my student for a while, and she sent me her PhD dissertation when it was done. And I didn't read it, but I was on sabbatical, so I read her dissertation. And I realized that she basically framed her whole dissertation as a response to Moriakira because she took that class. She was writing on Nishida, and then she took this class about Moriakira under me, and then she changed the whole thing. I didn't realize she did that. And when she did that, so suddenly everything she was saying about Nishida was pointed as a counterpoint to Moriakira, and it just really made me rethink everything. And so I ended up rewriting the whole book. I ended up reading Nishida, teaching Nishida for 2 semesters over this sabbatical, and rewriting the whole book in response to it. So, it was really a learning from my own student kind of moment. She's not really my student. She's more of like my kohai, my junior, under Nishira Sensei. Anyway, so that was anyway. So she was the one who pointed me to this article on education by Nishida Kitaro. And basically, this is the article that starts the Kyoto School of Education. And it's very, very hard to unpack because Nishi doesn't make sense half the time. And his concepts are scattered throughout several articles, and he never says where he said them. So it took a bit of sleuthing and a lot of help from Takaya-san to be able to figure this out. And these are the 3 key points: critique of abstract education, relational other, creative historical agent. I'll look at and explain, unpack today, and then I'll ground these using John Dewey's pragmatism. Just a quick point. I've always been deeply influenced by pragmatism, especially because of Mori Akira, who's the guy I've been doing maybe 6 years doing research on. Anyway, Nishida actually drew from William James, who was the older pragmatist, for this idea of pure experience. He actually taught Dewey in 1912. And but this connection with Dewey is rarely developed. The one that pointed me to, in order as an antidote to tendencies of the Kyoto school to get too dogmatically mystical, you need John Dewey. That idea is from Mori Akira. So I'm following Mori Akira on this point. Okay. So the 3 points, and start with the first point. How am I doing for time? I guess I am doing okay. All right. So let me read this out. Does educational studies not take the abstract, general, human as its idea? Against this, I am only suggesting that we should consider the concrete historical person instead. And so I take this line, doesn't seem all that much, but around it is actually a bunch of citations from J.F. Herbach, who is a Kantian and the first chair of education. And very important is Herbart very deeply influenced Japan. So I think if I would cite the biggest philosophical influences on Japan, I would say it's Herbart before the war, John Dewey after the war. And this is a 1930s, this is before the war, and mostly it was Herbart, very strong. So basically, Herbart's idea is that education aims at ethical aims. So very Kantian in that sense. But how to get to that Kantian way of autonomy, you use psychology, use empirical methods. And that was very moralistic tendency of education during the 1930s. And Nishida was very, very critical of this. So, very important when we look at the Kyoto School of Education. The Kyoto School of Education is not how Japanese education is. The Kyoto School of Philosophy, despite being the most popular school of philosophy, has always been a resistance, a non-majority. Most of our philosophy is exactly what Nishida said it shouldn't be, which is basically just copying Western philosophy and text critique. And in the same way, most of how the Kyoto School of Education is actually a resistance, a critique of how Japanese education was and continues to be. Yeah. So he was criticizing this whole idea of education that has basically very abstract views of the human being, either looking at the human being merely rationally or merely empirically, without seeing the relationship between the two. And so to make this a little bit more accessible, and Nishida never uses examples, you know. I was shocked to see, like, when you look at his life, he's actually a very, he was trying to do things politically. He was trying to really help his students. His students would visit him at home. His students would get into fights with him, and then he'd write his other students about it. He was a very engaged guy. But at the same time, if you read his texts, he doesn't say anything. And so I'll try to unpack it to make it more real, which is how I think he intended it to be, as a thinker, not as a writer. Okay, so let me read this example out. Junko-san has social anxiety and always fears being judged. She has difficulty with group work because she's afraid to be judged and is very anxious about the collaborative learning course. So, Kyushu University has this required collaborative learning course where you have to learn something by group work. And so she goes to the psychologist of the university who recommends the reasonable consideration. So, this is a legal requirement. We have to respond with reasonable consideration to those with some form of a, I don't know, mental health challenge. And so the reasonable consideration was to replace all group work with individual work. So basically, even if this is a collaborative learning course, just let her read a book and let her write about it and give her credit. However, Junko-san was always interested in maybe someday becoming a leader. I find this very interesting. You know, she wanted to become a leader and wonders if this is the wrong way to go about it. Okay, so this is the case I want to have in mind, and then let's go through the different parts of this idea of concrete historical persons. So he unpacked this idea through a temporal metaphor in the other essay, very long essay called I and Thou. And he says, where time is determined from the future, when we are as working, acting things, we are determined by the infinite ought. And so he talks about the Kantian dimension as like a call from the future. If I'm standing in the present, it calls me from the future. And with this metaphor, he refers to different ideas, different moral imperatives, but basically how we try to rationally make sense of our lives, you know, how we try to put things together and have things make sense as a whole in our lives using our intelligence. And so Nishida deeply valued Kant seeing the student as an autonomous, rational person, deserving respect as ends in themselves. So he repeatedly talks about Kant. He brings up so many Kantian ideas, actually. The idea of the sublime. Anyway, he talks about Kant a lot. But so what does this concretely mean? And as everyone is, I'm sure, well aware of, there's this very strong tension between hypothetical and categorical imperatives, right? And so Kant is always saying that we shouldn't be just focused on desires. So for example, Junko-san wants to avoid group work. Yeah, sure, that's what she wants, but is that necessarily good for her? And a very Herbartian approach, a very Kantian approach would be to say, hey, we need to educate for moral autonomy. So for example, if you go by categorical imperative, yeah, sure, you skip group work. But would you will that everyone who has social anxiety just skip every challenge that might give them social anxiety? It's interesting because if you ask students this, many of them will say, yeah, I mean, society should just be a nicer place. But an interesting thing is to ask them about their parents. So, it's like how would you feel if your mother, every time you make her anxious, she just avoids you? How do you feel if every time your mother you share with her something that stresses you out and she listens to you and she gets stressed out, she just says, "Oh, I don't want to listen to you anymore." And then suddenly they realize maybe that's not the kind of world I want to build, you know? And so in a sense, this is something that Nishida and Kant were trying to value, that it can't just be about desires. It can't just be about desires. And at the same time, it's also so this ideal element, can the will be self-consistent in willing a particular maxim? But at the same time, it's also about reducing the student to the ideals of others. I have to stress this because this is Japan, In Japan, when you say, hey, you got to think about the moral ought, many people don't think about the ought that they think about, that they will to be universal law. They think about what everybody else said should be universal law, so that's a very different issue. And I think, this is something that Nishida had to war against, because basically when they were using Herbart, they were using Herbart, but not in a Kantian sense, but in a Durkheimian sense, like Durkheim's methodological socialization, but basically how to get everyone behind the same idea of loyalty and filial piety to the emperor. So he was not happy. But so moral ideals are important, but that's just one part of students. That's not the whole of the student. And so we get to the infinite past. So if the ideals call you from the future, then the what do you call this? From the past, what we have is the material world. So if we call what determines us from the past with irrational inevitability material, therein we struggle with matter. So here he's again using it as a metaphor from the back, like it's pushing you from the back. Basically, the world of causation, the world of matter, the world of physical laws, but at the same time, the world of biological laws, impulses, what you directly sense, your drives, and this will eventually connect actually to the whole world of Karl Marx. By the way, this is heavily influenced by Nishida's own student. So his student was getting angry with him for being too idealist. And Tosaka Jun, he'd come to his house to pick a fight with him, and he'd spend the whole night talking to Tosaka Jun. And anyway, so Tosaka Jun actually deeply influenced his own research. And so he sees that this is also something that needs to be considered. And he also sees modern science as similar to scientific materialism, in that it tries to look not just at what should be the case, but what actually is the case, more empirical. And if we again transpose this to the Junko idea, basically the idea here is not just to respond to ideals, but also to the needs of students. What do we see from their experiential facts? So, this is something that on one hand, the previous one seemed very invalidating, seemed very more moral education than psychologists. But here, actually, psychologists can be very important. So, for example, it is simply a matter of fact that when Junko is in a social situation, she starts to shake, she starts to tremble, she gets panic attacks, she has difficulty breathing. And that's how it is for her. And this happens on a regular basis, and it's very difficult to think. It's very difficult to have a discussion when you're having a panic attack. And so it's very important to see that there are actually needs. So, there's a certain need for psychological safety that she doesn't have. By the way, one of the difficulties I've found in education in Japan is that the ought is stressed so hard. Like, you're supposed to be like this. You're supposed to be like this. I actually just came off of a call this morning about one of the students I'm co-advising. That same problem. It hits the point that what ought to be has been drilled in so much that they don't even know what they need anymore. I was asking the student, what do you need in order to be able to actually move forward on this project? you know, but I'm supposed to do this. But I'm supposed to do this. Yeah, but what do you need? And then what do you feel? What are you struggling with? And so this is something that Nishida said we have to pay more attention to. Now you have both the past and you have both and the future. So it's not a one-sided abstraction of ideals or materiality. And the concrete person stands in the present, trying to reconcile both. Now, this is a very important point. So let me read this out. What is thought of as the infinite flow of time actually does not begin from the past nor from the future. One can think that time is the self-determination of the eternal now. The present determines itself. This is a very Zen Buddhist image of the threefold flow of time in Dogen. This is actually also directly influenced by St. Augustine. Anyway, the main idea here is embracing the tensional and contradictory nature of the person. So very important is he didn't see this as an additive thing. It's not like, oh, I have needs and I have demands, moral demands, but the needs and the moral demands are in tension with each other. And I have to live in the eternal now, in the present, standing, pushed and pulled from various directions, and the struggle of that. the struggle of that. So looking at this individual student, what they need, what they're trying to do. And a very simple practical point here is the need for individual student guidance. So not just saying top down how students are supposed to respond to various things, but kind of seeing what's going to move them toward a balance and equilibrium depends on where they are. And if, some students need more, some students need more pushing for ideals when they get too wrapped up in their own desires. But some students might need the opposite. They need to be told, hey, put the ideals down for a bit and listen to yourself. And so again, a much more customized approach, which I think Nishida was doing in his own life. Okay, but the very important point here is that it's not just having both, but it's this tension and also this reconciliation. I really like this part. Submitting to impulses means the self-negation of the self, but we can see a truly free personal self where the ought embraces impulses. So I think this is not acceptable for Kant, I think. The whole idea that it's not a universal abstraction, but in a sense, yes, we have ideals, but the ideals have to look at the needs, have to look at the context and ask, in this particular situation, what does it mean? Not to, for example, laziness versus diligence, is not just some abstract ideal of diligence, but what does it mean for this student to take a step toward diligence? Or in the case of Junko, courage, for example, or engaging others. What does it mean to take a step toward that when you know that you have a social anxiety problem? So, in a sense, this is a very difficult balancing act. We're not just invalidating the anxiety by saying you have to be courageous, you have to have a sense of leadership, but at the same time, you're not just submitting to the anxiety. I think, I was so upset when I met this student because you could see how, in a sense, after she talked to the psychologist, she kind of gave up on herself. She said, well, the psychologist says, well, this is how I am. And well, what am I going to do? Right. And so the whole idea, and we can't miss the part that, yes, you have these needs, but how do you respond to those needs? So there's a tension, and how do you address this tension? And very important here is because this is a unity of contradictories. It's not a single determination just from needs, just rolling the dice, the utilitarian dice, and just seeing how they pan out. Versus, it's also not just a Hegelian fixed trudge toward logic and reason. Because it's a unity of contradictories, it's an indeterminacy. It's a site of freedom. This is a point where, in a sense, and Nishida really stresses this, the what it really means to have leadership or what it really means to have courage. The student shapes the predicate. The student shapes that value by the choices that they will make in their real context. It in a sense, I make it real. It's not a pre-existing good. I give birth to a new form of the good as I struggle in each point of the eternal now. However, very important is precisely because this is an indeterminacy, um, there's a great sense of uncertainty and groundlessness. There's no fixed answer. But should I just am I not supposed to just screw this anxiety and just have leadership? Well, but am I not supposed to just do what I need? Shouldn't I have what I need? Well, suddenly it becomes very ambiguous, and that can also be very difficult. Okay, so that's in Nishida, trying to look at the person, concrete historical person, as someone that bears these tensions. And what I wanted to point out was, despite Dewey's remarkably optimistic way of writing, I think that you see this tensional existence in John Dewey as well. So, tension between materiality and ideals are at the core of classical pragmatism. So, Sammy Pilstrom, who's Paul and I work with, and so William James said, thinking is not separate from, but is part of our adapting to empirical reality. So again, this not separating the world of the ideal and the world of the real or the empirical. And then Dewey also takes this whole non-dualism via the idea of empirical naturalism. So it's a weird use of words, but by empirical here, he means experiential, subjective, and then natural, he means objective. And so he sees these two as in tension, and the resolution with this done via the indeterminacy of what he calls intelligent action. So this response, this thinking flexibly and responsibly in while looking at what's actually going on in reality. And so there's a need to look at both facets of students, both their empirical side and their natural side, but also so, sorry, so the natural facts of the students, but also how they subjectively give meaning to their situation. So this also connects to the kind of science that we use, right? Not just understanding students in terms of mechanistic science, not just classifying them, not just explaining their problems away in terms of neuroreceptors and things like that, but seeing still how do they give meaning to that situation. And also at the same time to be able to examine how students are reconciling this tension. By the way, one of Catherine's talking, JP, really connected to this, but basically the idea that we can be looking at facts, actual stories of actual students, and very rigorously analyzing those experiences, but at the same time be able to see the structure of the tension between idealism and materialism and how they try to resolve it. So again, being this certain pragmatic attitude toward knowing our students, and it also connects to ethics. Not so Dewey says that it's not about an a priori categorical imperative nor given desires, but reason transforming existing desires. Kurt Biesta says something similar to that, guiding them toward more reasonable fulfillment. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part, interaction of I and thou. So when you look at the student this way, I think it's very, very clear. But what kind of a relationship does the teacher have with the student? I think it's interesting here. We have Paul and Roe and Kasser in the same room, and in a sense, what kind of a relationship do we have with our students is a very real question for us, I think. And so I want to read this out. Education, I believe, can be thought of as a kind of formative process. And the educator forms the human being as a sculpture, as a sculptor forms a sculpture. But true formation is not merely the objective manifestation of the subject, but the self-manifestation of the object. The imagination and the mind of the sculptor is not directly the sculpture itself. In artistic creation, the artist himself does not know what kind of work will be created. There must be a creative action of subject-object unity. I think this is beautiful. He was not a sculptor. He was a calligrapher, but he did have experience of making art, and he understands that making art is not necessarily just a one-way engineering of things, but a dialogue with things. So on one hand, he acknowledges a very strong formative intent to education, not very symmetric. But at the same time, he really sees the indeterminacy. It's an influence, but it's between one person and another. So there's a personal encounter between the student and the teacher. Very interesting. It came up in the ENOJP that some teachers, when they're asked about this, it's like, how do you want to shape your students? How do you want to help your students transform? Some teachers are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Do I even have the right to transform my students? I mean, what if they just want to stay the way they are? And so there's a fundamental daring here, to connect with people on this level where very deep changes happen, sorry. Okay. And so there are two elements here with tensional. One is alterity. I and thou are absolutely other. There is no universal that embraces I and thou. This is very Levinasian idea. So not presuming that you know what a student needs, but seeing how they are trying to encounter a situation. Can never really presume how the student, the needs, maybe you can presume, the ought, maybe you can presume, but how the needs and the ought are going to come together, no way you can presume that. But there's a risk of falling into the opposite extreme of dismissing a student. I've seen teachers do this. They're like, well, if you look at postmodernity, we can't understand the subjectivity of students. So I'm not going to presume to understand my students. Yes, but then it doesn't mean we abandon them either. So there's also this, at the same time, this sense of responsibility to the other. For there to be true formative action at the base of objective beings ought to be that which commands us, know what creates us. this very strong idea here that, in a sense, the student calls out this response from me. So we try to help students according to how they're unfolding, not according to our own plans. But very important here is it requires a very strong negation of one's image of what the other should be. Again, very Levination point. Um, getting the totality that we reduce students into. So Nishida connects this to a realizing of one's radical evil. He uses the content idea here, but to mean a different thing. How we tend to distort, similar to the idea of violence in Levinas, how we distort the other into our own image of them, how we privilege our own desires and understandings when relating with the thou, turning them into a non-person. And so the reason why you can have both responsibility and alterity is because despite our singularity, we are relational. I always like Jean-Luc Nancy. I think it really connects to this point. But there, so he talks about how despite this uniqueness in the eternal now, the infinite past, the physical world is not solitary, but we share this with others. We share environments with others. I share this Philippine background to a certain extent with Roe, for example. And we also share ideals with others. Like, for example, we have certain ways of valuing subjective education and existential education, which I think we share. But at the same time, there's this, when it comes to that indeterminate point where these two meet, how's that going to come together? And so this is where we have this very liminal sense of connection between two people who are acting in the eternal now. So he says, when the self sees the absolute other in the self, oneself becomes that which lives by dying. He says this over and over again. The self becomes self by recognizing the person of another, and one can say that at the bottom of the I, there art thou, and at the bottom of the thou, there I am. This is very similar to Kant, but very important is because of how we structure the infinite past and infinite future. It's Kant, but made doubly difficult. So it's not just recognizing that the other person is a rational person. It's recognizing the other person also has needs, which is kind of the John Stuart Mill's kind of compassion. And at the same time, but most importantly, I guess, for Nishida, is it's respecting the fact that this student is also working out this tension between the material and the rational. Okay, so again, very tensional, very existential idea of relationship in education. But I also think that this is something that deeply resonates with John Dewey's pragmatism. So Dewey says education begins with a unique student. He says training must, however, be based upon the natural tendencies. That is, we must find its point of departure in them, in the students. And I think it really makes it much more practical. It makes us really ask about our own habits as teachers. But for example, can we have learning goals before we meet our students? And this is very difficult because we're required to write our syllabi before we even meet a class. And I think that could be good to a certain extent. But how much flexibility do we have toward our syllabi? I think is an important question. And then also, so that's the alterity side. But at the same time, Dewey's not solipsist. So his best friend was George Herbert Mead, and habits, thinking, and even identity arise in relation to others. So he talks about how even thinking and language basically come from how we talk to others. And so Dewey is well known for this whole process of problem solving, the individual trying to make sense of and fix its problems. But very important is that this problem solving was never meant to be by the isolated individual. We encounter shared problems. Or even if you see a personal problem, we articulate it with words, which are shared ideas, right? And we respond with shared tools, shared ideas. Thus, individual learning, and this is from Human Nature and Conduct, individual learning is about transforming social customs, a process wherein one intelligently adapts customs to conditions and thereby remakes them. So, when students solve problems, and I guess this is where we get to the problem of fake active learning or fake Deweyan education. When students solve problems in problem solving learning, does anything they learn really make a difference to social customs? So I think that really depends on how we're teaching, whether or not they'll be real in that sense. So in Democracy and Education, he says not only is social life identical with communication, but all communication and hence all genuine social life is educative. To be a recipient of a communication is to have an enlarged and changed experience. So he starts with this unique experiential center, but at the same time connects this experience communicatively. So it's like it starts with phenomenology, but then it turns into cooperation. So again, what kind of relationships do we encourage students to have with each other? Japan has a tendency to really talk about cooperation, but at the same time run things in terms of a competition. And I think, with the ranking of each student posted up every year, and I think that's something that really needs a lot of thought. Okay, so third point, historical agency. What is the place of our students in society and history? So, given this view, history is not merely the march of reason in Hegel or the conflicts of materialist history in Marx. It's not predetermined, but rather history includes both our thrownness and our freedom. So, thrownness here, let me read it out. The historical mission of contemporary Japan ought to be its educational idea. We need to ground ourselves in the soil of present Japan. Taking the standpoint of present Japan is not negating its past history. Living means always taking one's center in the present and having a past and a future. So, very interesting here is that he says education is not led by a moral idea, ethos. It's led by a historical ethos. And we educate students to become part of history. And part of history is being able to be where you are now. And so making sure that our education connects to the real challenges. So AI, the environment, even in psychology circles, we're finding that there's basically a new syndrome right now. But so many students are young people are coming to their psychiatrists, psychologists, basically with a deep sense of despair because of how messed up our world has become. Part of this is the Israel-Gaza sort of thing, but also the environmental catastrophe, and many people are simply just losing hope. And it's become a real issue that even psychology conferences have to bring up. But are we, in a sense, education, are we able to address the real problems that are coming up? But this is not perspective taking to merely the needs of the whole, nor the expectations of the whole. So this is the very tricky part. Some people misunderstand this part completely against Nishida's intentions as a form of totalitarianism. Somehow, I find this ridiculous. It's like the minute you care about a totality, people think you're totalitarian. It's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, um, and one of the things that he points out, and I think is actually psychologically a very astute point, I think it connects to Catherine's research on George Herbert Mead too, is that when you see yourself as part of the whole, if you think about it in terms of infinite past, then it's the needs of the whole. What kind of citizens does the 21st century need? What kind of human resources? If we think about it in terms of infinite future, then it's the expectations of the whole. Like, a good American should be like this, or a good British citizen should be like this. But when you think about history as something that's working itself out in an indeterminate way, bearing the tension of both needs and expectations, both material and ideal things, then it's a very, very different kind of perspective taking to a whole. It's similar to the perspective taking that you do when you have a family in family counseling. You don't want the members of the family just to do what's expected, nor just to respond to what's needed urgently in a short term, but in a sense it's getting them to work out that collective tension together. So he says, what I refer to as the idea of education above might be taken as too historicist or statist. However, I by no means do I belittle the idea of humans as free individuals. I am I by recognizing thou as thou, and thou art thou by recognizing I am I. So there's this idea here of creativity and freedom. Our individual selves as the extremities of socio-historical determination conversely have the creative significance of possessing the power to determine history and remake society. So this idea that yes, I am social stuff. I am made of relational stuff. I'm made of relational ideas. I live in a world of tools that is shared. But at the same time, how I put that together shapes back that relationality, shapes society back. But very interesting here is that it's very different from, so a lot of discourses of creativity are very essentialist, like you're born with creativity. But one of the differences with Nishida, I think, is that he sees creativity as something that is a very demanding project. It is a result of letting go of self to take the perspective of a self-forming whole. By the way, George Herbert Mead says a very similar thing. He basically says, if you can't take the perspective of the whole, you have no right to lead it. You cannot really be creative in that space unless you can perspective take to that space. And so there's this really strong need to negate the closed boundaries of the ego and awaken to a sense of the nothingness of the self, which is deeply discussed in Nishihira's book. And again, historical evidence for Nishida not being a totalitarian is in his letters. Yeah. So again, connecting it to Dewey, this idea of democracy not in the boring sense, just as a political set of political functions, voting and things like that, but seeing it as a way of life. So in Democracy and Education, he says education is for growth, not just for individuals, but of communal life. And he talks about this interesting criteria of democracy. He says, how numerous and varied are the interests which are consciously shared? How full and free is the interplay with other forms of association? And it's interesting because you look at this and you see just how terribly we're doing. And I think an interesting thing is how these two are in tension with each other. So some people are so interested in the first one, having interests shared within a group, that they forget the second one. You know, the group gets so narcissistic about its own ideals that it no longer cooperates with other groups, which I think is the great danger with things like MAGA. But at the same time, we can go to the opposite extreme and be so interested in being able to cooperate in a globalizing world that we don't actually share interests anymore. It's okay to not necessarily speak the same language as other people, but if you don't communicate at all with your fellow citizens, are you really fellow citizens? And so, in a sense, Dewey was posing this double challenge to what it means to be a community. I mean, I don't think it has to be democracy, but democracy as a way of life. Interestingly, this is very similar to what Eleanor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize in economics for, the economics of the commons, this idea of the commons. And it was also a predecessor of deliberative democracy. And so these individual and communal growth become then a key part of curriculum. So in democracy and education, the latter part, geography and science classes help us see how we connect with others in our relationship with the environment. So not just memorizing these facts, but having a sense of kinship with other people as they deal with the environment. And then history about learning how we connect with each other in society and over time. Civics and moral education doing that a little bit more directly. However, very interesting is that it's not just about curriculum, but also about social critique. So not just the socialization function, but the social critique function. And so Dewey writes that a lot of these dualisms actually come from the mutual hostility of classes. So the separation of the ruling class and laborers results in the dualism between the thinking and the doing. And so how can we expect people to act in a democratic way and to grow into pragmatic problem solvers if, to begin with, we aren't able to do anything about the social class problem? And Nishida did not face this directly, but Mori Akira did, his indirect student. Okay, so that's basically it. Just a quick summary. So Nishida allows me to take up the question of how Japanese philosophy can respond to social concerns in real life, not just Japan, but around the world. And so on one hand, we have Nishida, criticizing educational abstraction that reduces students to generalities, encouraging a deep personal respect of the thou, seeing this Tao as grounded creatively in a historical context. And all of these connect to John Dewey, non-dualism of empirical naturalism, the alterity and communication of the experiential subject, and then this idea of democratic education. But just this last part I want to read out because it's very important. We can combine these with a pragmatic philosophy of awakening, where we look at the student non-dualistically, but highlight the tension between their facets and the resulting groundlessness. So all those parts I wrote in yellow were what I felt would be contributions of the philosophy of awakening of the Kyoto school. one of my problems with John Dewey, and Catherine said this very bluntly. She was like, I don't like Dewey because you read him and he says it like it's so easy to think, to be pragmatic. And yeah, and so I think what I really value with the Kyoto School is how it stresses that this is so hard because it involves taking up deep contradictions in the human person. So we emphasize communication, but we highlight the negation of the encounter of the I and Thou. And we argue for democratic citizenship, but we highlight the self transcendence needed to open oneself to the self formation of history. So these are all elements of awakening to nothingness, which are shared by the whole Kyoto School. And me personally, I deeply value as an educator and a thinker. Anyway, that's me. 50 minutes, 5 minutes longer than I thought, but I hope that's okay.
Thank
Anyway,
you,
I'm
Anton.
really hoping for everyone's comments. Yoshiko.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. Shall I stop recording, Anton? So people
Sure, it's up to you. Sure.
yeah,